Well, it is one thing to talk about our God being the God who provides. It's a whole nother thing for us to actually live that out. What it means to actually trust God to be a provider. We're going to read a story tonight that centers around this. In fact, this is where you get the phrase Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. It comes from the story. Does anybody know what story it comes from in the Old Testament? Not Elijah. Abraham. What story of Abraham? When Isaac was going to get stabbed. Okay. Yes. So, the story of Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac. And so, the Lord who provides. Let me ask you this. Imagine you're in this situation. All right, so you're this man. God comes to and says, hey, you're going to be my chosen person. And I'm going to bless the nations through you. In fact, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the sand on the shore or as the stars in the sky. And it's going to come from you and your 90-year-old wife who was never able to have a child. And you say, sure thing, God. And you follow him out to this promised land that he says, yes, go look around, but it's not going to be yours yet. In fact, it's going to be your descendants after like 400 years. So you're never going to see it. Sure, God. And then comes the day that your 90-year-old wife has miraculously conceived, and she's going to have this child. So you're like, okay, God can keep this. God can provide. And then as he grows up and he gets older, you're wondering all the ways that God's going to prove faithful and provide for you through this descendant, that he's going to accomplish this promise through this child that was miraculously conceived. And then comes the point where God says to you, Abraham, get up, take your son, go on top of this mountain, and sacrifice him. Is he still the God who provides? So I think there's a lot of times that we see God provide things for us, that when he then calls us to be obedient and follow him into something where it does not make sense, we kind of face this moment, this test of whether or not we really believe he is the God who provides or not. So we're going to read this story tonight. If we go to Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. I want to say this about God testing us. Two things. One, you can't really know something about someone until they actually do something. Like, you get married and you think, I know this person I'm getting married to, until you actually see that person. And then you know things because you've actually seen it. God's knowledge of us is based on real things. It's not based on your aspirations of who you want to be, and it's not based on my aspirations. It's based on who we actually are and we actually prove ourselves to be when we're tested. The thing is, God knows what the test is going to produce. It's not that God, it has to be a real test that takes place for it to be truly knowable, but it's not like God doesn't know the outcome before the test happens either. But you don't. And a lot of times God tests us, not so much so that he will figure out things about us, but so that we will recognize things about ourselves as well and be able to give a testimony to it to others who are around us and observe us going through it. So God tests Abraham and says to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now pause right there. what do you do at that point? Is he the God who provides? That point, what do you do? Because if he really is the God who provides, then he's the God who provides in the circumstances that make sense to you and in the ones that don't. You know, if you have this clear direction from God, go do this thing, then it's not a question of whether or not ultimately he's going to be able to keep his promises or not. I'll tell you what went through Abraham's thought in this moment, because we're told in the book of Hebrews. Here's what Abraham thought. God will not fail to keep his promise, even if it means he has to raise Isaac from the dead. He had to come to a realization of, okay, even if it makes no earthly sense how this could happen, if God's calling me to do this, and God has made these promises, my job is to be faithful and obedient. And so he gets up early in the morning, saddled his donkey. Look at that. Like, there's a lot of things that, I'm not an early morning person. I don't like getting up early. It takes me really wanting to do something to get up early. If I have something that I'm dreading, I'm less likely to get up for it. Do you think Abraham was dreading this or not? Like, even in his dread, he still gets up to go and be obedient quickly. And he saddled his donkey and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac, and he split wood for a burnt offering and set out to the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, notice that. How many times are we really good at being obedient to difficult callings that God places in my life the first day or 2? But you also know how the longer you have to endure in obedience, when the fruit's not coming and when the season's difficult, how much more we, through that time period, start reflecting, doubting, questioning. Okay, God, you said that I should do this, and it's been 3 weeks, and I'm really not seeing what you wanted. Did I misunderstand you? Are you really going to, are you going to drop the ball, God? Did I mess up by putting my trust in you? It's a lot harder to be obedient when it's something that's actually drawn out. And you think about Abraham, what's he probably thinking about the whole 3 days that he's going to this mountain? It's not a pleasant thought. And he looked up and saw the place in the distance. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we'll come back to you." I don't think he's mistaken when he says, "and then we will come back to you." And again, it's what Hebrews revealed. Even if he should have to raise him from the dead. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And in his hand he took the knife and the fire, and the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to his father and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." And Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them walked on together. And when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on the top of the wood. If we pause right there, you see the radical commitment to him being the God who provides? This is a man who actually has taken that and embodying it. This is a man that it is costly for him to trust that he's the God who provides. He is placing himself in his God's hands. And if his God were to drop him, there's no safety net. This is what it means to trust he's the God who provides. It's also not just this helplessness. It's not like, okay, well, if God provides, then I'm just going to sit back and do nothing. No, it's obedience. It's saying, I'm going to build my life. I'm going to make decisions. I'm going to commit myself to ways of going forward that are in full dependence on who you have revealed yourself to be, God. And if I come out looking like a lunatic, which if you read this story and think he doesn't look like a lunatic, I don't know how you're not sane. This is crazy. The only reason why we read this story and we think affectionately about Abraham is because we know the end of the story. But in the middle of this story, he doesn't know the end of the story. He's risking everything. How likely do you think it is that his marriage survives if he comes back home and says, honey, I sacrificed our son today? Like, not likely. How likely do you think he even gets back home when he comes back down from the mountain and the men that went with him, the young men, remember Abraham's like 113 at this point? Like, he's not going to be able to like fight against them. But if he comes back down the mountain and the young men that helped him carry all this stuff out here is like, where's Isaac? And he's like, oh, I killed him back there. How likely do you think they're just like, okay, and follow him back to camp? Like, this is a point where God, being a provider who keeps his promises and proves himself faithful, is coming to such a head for Abraham that if God does not prove to actually be that, Abraham is ruined. And yet Abraham has deliberately, for days, at great expense to himself, and with eagerness in his obedience, placed himself there. Like, God couldn't make Abraham get up and go on the mountain to put himself in this radical of a dependence on God. This was Abraham had to place himself there. Abraham had to say, all of these things that promise me security and hope in this world, I will willingly give away and put myself totally in your hands, God. Because I would rather be dependent on you than these other things. I'll give you an example. In this moment, Abraham has to make a choice of who is most likely to give him descendants. Isaac, his biological son, who we know has many children. Like, God, Spirit, the one who makes promises to him. Which one's going to be most likely to keep the promise of the descendants that would be numerous and would bless the nations? The child he can see or the God he can't? And as radical of a choice as this is in Abraham's life, here's the reality. You and I face this decision on a daily basis. Think about it. Do I do things in an honest and trustworthy way? Because my God has told me that this is the way to live. Or do I take that little bit of money out of the cash register when no one's looking because I trust more that that's a way to provide for myself than my God? Do I trust my God who says that not returning an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, instead letting go of vengeance and seeking to be a blessing to those who curse me is the way to live? Or do I look at the person who is coming at me to strike me, to curse me, to chew me out, and think, no, the best way to retaliate, the best thing to do is to retaliate. That ultimately, if I want to be protected and provided for, I've got to take vengeance into my own hands and not trust it into God's. We face choices like this every day on a different scale, different environments. But every one of them comes down to this. Do we trust God to provide for us? Or do we think we have to provide for ourselves? And if you listen real closely, you hear the hiss of the serpent who in the garden used that exact temptation to tempt Adam and Eve. It's not a new device. And Abraham, at the moment of his most radical obedience, is going to put him in a position where if God does not prove to be the God who provides for him, at that most radical moment, you know what happens? Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. Now, I'm sure if they had counselors, Abraham and Isaac probably needed to go to some therapy sessions together after this moment. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he replied, Here I am. And then he said, Do not lay a hand on your boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And so Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham named that place, The Lord Will Provide. Not may. It's not the Lord may provide. It's the Lord will provide. You know, this is a choice that you and I have to make on a daily basis. Do we trust that if we live according to God's ways, that necessarily comes with you're going to put yourselves in positions that if God fails, you're going to look like a fool. If God fails to provide for you, you're going to have to go without. If God fails to provide for you, you're not going to have what you need. If God fails to provide for you, you're going to lose access to resources and to people and to reputation and to all of these things. If God fails, you are going to be made out to the one, you're going to be the one that loses. And that fear is what causes us to say, no, I need to take things into my own hands. I'm not going up the mountain with my son. I'm not going to do that because God, the promises that you made, he's the key to it. And what Abraham did is recognized it wasn't Isaac who was the key, it was God. And so we have to make that choice. Do we believe he's the God who will provide? Or do we believe he's the God who may provide? Because how convinced you are of one of those, it's really going to determine of how much your life you actually build based on who God has shown himself to be. And so, I just want us to take a few minutes and pray. I know enough about the shared human experience that we all have. Every one of us face this. Challenges to trust that God will be the one who will provide. And do we need to take it into our own hands or trust him? And I want us to just pray. Be honest with God about where you are in that struggle. Father, we know that all things are yours. So when it comes to you making promises to us, we know that you can keep them. Help us to trust that you are the God who will provide. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Who all needs a prayer sheet? All right. Can I get somebody to pass out prayer sheets? Thank you. All right. So we are going to pray for faith, that we would trust our God and what he lays before us to do, and that we would resist putting our hope in the circumstances around us, but center our hope in who our God is. For obedience, that we would step into those things which God calls us to with eagerness, just like Abraham, who immediately got up and was obedient, even in a challenging calling. That we would be resolute in our obedience, despite how perseverance may cause us to struggle and have difficulty, what it looks like to walk with Jesus, to be obedient in the long term, even when fruitfulness doesn't seem to be coming, but that we would endure to see the fruit of our obedience. And then knowledge of God, that God would cause our hearts to be filled with wonder at who he is, that we would be guided by the Spirit to know our God in all truth, and that we would walk humbly before God, surrendering our minds and convictions to his work. So let's just spend time praying over this.